Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonya, did you have a question? I saw your hand was raised. Folks can feel free to enter any questions into the chat that you might have about the webinar structure, how things are going to work tonight. But we do recommend that folks use the Q&A function to ask any questions related to the presentation. That way it's really easy for us to go through and answer questions at the end of the presentation. As folks are trickling in, would you want to maybe put in the chat where you're zooming in from? Be curious to know where everyone's at. Hi from all over. We got some folks from, wow, California, BC, Portland, Newport. Oh, that's great. Thank you, everyone. Washington. I'm just going to give it another minute or two to let folks trickle in. For new attendees that just signed on, if you want to go ahead and put in the chat where you're zooming in from, we'd love to hear it. Sounds like we have folks from all over the West Coast. That's great. From BC to California. Happy Orca Action Month, everybody. Okay. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I don't know how many more people are going to join us if it's nice and sunny or they have the opportunity to catch a sunset. I really appreciate you all for taking the time to be here with us this evening. Yeah, so just to start off, my name is Annie Merrill. I'm the Marine Conservation Manager with Oregon Shores. And this is the Protecting the Pod webinar, where we're going to be talking about solutions for the survival of Oregon's orcas. And we are joined by Howard Takata, who I'll give more of a formal introduction to in just a minute. He's our guest speaker of the evening. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay. So tonight's agenda, we're going to start with some brief introductions, talking a little bit about Oregon Shores, why we're here today. And then we're going to go through Howard's presentation. It sounds like it's going to be around 30 or so minutes, which leaves us plenty of time for question and answers. So if folks have any questions that come up during the presentation, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat to ask your questions, and you can ask throughout the whole webinar, and we'll be sure to get to those at the very end. And then at the very end, we just have a handful of action items and announcements. And just FYI, the webinar is being recorded, and there'll be a link to view that will be made available to all the participants, anybody who registered, and then you're welcome to share it out. It'll be posted to Oregon Shore's YouTube page. So yeah, I will follow up with any resources that we talk about tonight and that recording link after the webinar. All right. So just to get things started here, for folks who aren't familiar with Oregon Shores, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. So we're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate and empower people to protect our coastal ecosystems and communities in Oregon. And we stemmed from the Oregon Beach Bill, which was passed in 1967. And we have been working to protect this hard-won public access ever since. And we've been working to protect the entire coastal region, our landscapes, ecosystems, and communities ever since. So that's been over 50 years of action. Our focus area is the entire Oregon coast, from the Columbia River to the California border, and from the crest of the coastal mountains to the edge of the continental shelf. So we have a wide range of topics that we focus on to achieve our mission. This is our small but mighty team. We have different specialties and areas of focus. So collectively, we can do more to advocate, engage, educate, and inspire action to protect the coast. We fight for coastal conservation through legal action and advocacy, and we engage our network of volunteers and members in community science projects to mobilize participation in public policy. We also have education programming to engage students and train teachers on marine conservation and science topics. So I'm Annie Merrill. Again, I'm the Marine Conservation Manager. So I manage all of our marine and estuarine conservation advocacy programs and initiatives. And then my counterpart, Mandy Watson, focuses on land use, beaches, dunes, and shoreline management. So the whole conservation side of our organization is just two people right now. This is a really cool diagram that kind of helps display all the things that we're involved in, and we call it our theory of change. So this is how we work to protect the coast. Essentially, through education and public engagement, we hope to inspire stewardship, which can then inspire action to shape public policy, which will help advance conservation and improve the management of our critical resources. So we engage at all of these levels to help communities get involved, either in education or community science, or taking action on specific public policy objectives. And here's some quick photos of what that looks like in action. So we do a lot with the help of many partner organizations, of course, and as well as agencies. So we do beach cleanups, we host and attend a number of events, we survey the coastline, train students and teachers, we work on passing legislation, and so much more. So it's just a brief little snapshot. And our top conservation priority for the foreseeable future is to build resilience for Oregon's estuaries, ocean, and coastal land. And we really try and look at this holistically and focus on the connectivity between coastal ecosystems, from our watersheds to our estuaries, all the way to the nearshore tide pools and reefs to deep ocean habitat on the outer continental shelf. We recognize the connectivity between all of these systems, and we ensure that our work is informed by science. And we really work to protect the integrity of these ecosystems as well, and protect the critical habitat that offers resilience benefits in particular. So we focus on strategic habitat like eelgrass or kelp forests that simultaneously sequester carbon and offer resilience benefits to support biodiversity. So some of the public policy initiatives and topic areas that we're invested in right now include estuary planning, implementing the territorial sea plan and our system of marine protected areas. We're involved in the offshore wind roadmap process in Oregon, ensuring the offshore wind siting and planning is happening responsibly, as well as shoreline management issues. We also aim to protect endangered and imperiled species and the habitats that support them. So southern resident killer whales are a species of importance to us right now. And interestingly, this diagram really displays how orcas are intricately connected to many of these priorities that I just named. So that's in part why we're really invested in supporting their recovery. So this diagram shows, juvenile fish in our estuaries are super important prey species for southern residents, and they migrate from our estuaries to the outer coast to our rocky reefs, and then support southern residents and their recovery out there. So that just displays the connectivity between systems, but also how we view our conservation work. So this brings me to Orca Action Month, which is happening right now throughout the month of June. And the intention of Orca Action Month is to celebrate and participate in bringing awareness to the plight of southern resident killer whales, which are extremely imperiled. And we do this through outreach, events, and different calls to action. And this is a coordinated effort across the entire Pacific coast. We have partners in Washington and California. And Oregon Shores has participated in the last couple of years in Orca Action Month as a member of the Orca Salmon Alliance. And our goal is to really help bring awareness and awareness about the southern residents' utilization of Oregon waters in particular, and ensure that the state of Oregon is doing everything it can to support its recovery. And this is because there's a lot of room for the state to do more, to develop programs and strategies and commit to protecting southern residents. And we're on track to do this, and we're building momentum toward this end. So far, Oregon listed the southern residents under the state's Endangered Species Act in February of 2024. And this prompted the current development of the Endangered Species Management Plan for southern residents, which is coordinated by state agencies right now. And then Governor Kotek also formally proclaimed June as Orca Action Month, both last year in 2024 and then this year, which signals more support for protecting these species. So that brings me to our guest speaker tonight, Howard Takata. He is from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's the Southern Resident Orca Conservation Coordinator. He's worked for the agency for 27 years and is a wealth of knowledge on orcas and salmon. And he's going to go deeper into discussing what we know about Oregon's orcas and what the department is currently doing to aid in their recovery. So I'm going to pass it to Howard.
Okay, great. Thanks for that introduction, Annie, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, can I share it now?
Sorry, that should work. Let me troubleshoot for a second. Okay, does it work now?
Okay, I'll try it again.
Great, we can see it.
All right. How's that?
Yeah, perfect. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity during Orca Action Month, especially to help increase awareness of all the different types of orcas that we have off the Oregon coast, and to shine a spotlight, I think, on one particular population, the southern residents, which were, as Annie mentioned, listed as endangered in Oregon last year. So I'm going to start out with some background information on orcas in general, and then I'll go over some of the orca ecotypes that occur off the Oregon coast. And then I'd like to spend the second half of my talk focusing on the southern residents, their life history, habitat, population status, and some of the main threats to their survival and recovery. And then I'll finish up with talking about some of the things that we still need to learn about the southern residents that'll help guide our recovery efforts, and then some of the actions that we can take to help recover the population. So the scientific name for orcas is Orcinus orca, and Orcinus means from the underworld. And I think it has to do with the fact that they're kind of seen as a sort of a notorious predator. Um, and orca means a large-bellied pot or vase. And I'm guessing that has to do with maybe the cylindrical shape of the orca's body. Um, and they do go by a couple of different common names, orcas and also killer whales. Most of us, I think, grew up uh, knowing them as killer whales. And they originally got that name when Spanish sailors, not sure if it was the 17th or 18th century, um, observed them attacking and killing large whales. And so the original Spanish name was or meant killer of whales. But when it was translated to English, the words kind of got switched around and it became killer whale. And um, that was kind of unfortunate because I think it gave them sort of this reputation as these whales that were, vicious killers, and um, you know, I mean, all predators kill their prey. So, why should we single out orcas as killers? But some people prefer to call them orcas, which is their species name. But most of the scientific community and NOAA Fisheries, which oversees threatened and endangered marine mammals, still call them killer whales, and it's fine. I think either name is appropriate. Having said that, they are in fact not whales. They're the largest member of the dolphin family, Delphinidae, and they have the largest distribution of any cetacean. Um, they're found in all of the world's oceans, everywhere from the tropics to the Arctic and Antarctic oceans. Although they are more commonly found in like coastal areas in temperate zones, and there are about 50,000 orcas worldwide. And when it comes to their physical characteristics, I think they're pretty easily recognizable by their iconic black and white coloration and their large, prominent dorsal fins, which can get up to about 6 feet in a large male. And then males in general can get to around 25 feet in length and 12,000 pounds. Females are a little bit smaller, 20 feet, averaging 20 feet and 9,000 pounds. Reproduction is somewhat delayed in orcas. Oftentimes, females won't have their first calf until they're somewhere between 15 and 20 years of age. So orcas use various whistles and calls for communicating. They also use echolocation, which is a series of clicks for navigation and for finding their prey. Um, Orcas are at the top of the marine food web, so they don't have any natural predators. And so they've found that the main sources of mortality are malnutrition, disease, and traumatic injury, oftentimes in the form of vessel strikes. As far as lifespan goes, you know, males average around 30 years, up to about a maximum of 60 years. Females tend to live longer, averaging around 50 years, but they can get to be 90 or 90 years or older. I think the current oldest orca is the matriarch of the southern resident population. Her name is Ocean Sun, and she's estimated to be about 98 years of age. So they can get to be quite old. I think the oldest one was over 100 years old. Um, uh, and one, I think helpful thing about orcas is they have unique or dorsal fins and saddle patches. And saddle patches are that pigmented area behind the dorsal fin that are unique to individual orcas. And so they're basically like a fingerprint. The dorsal fin that varies in size and shape. They might have certain nicks or scars in it. And similarly with the saddle patch, it'll vary in size and shape, pigmentation. Sometimes there'll be scratches on it. Um, so for some populations, particularly the resident populations, they've been able to basically get a photo of every member of the population and built up um, sort of a database for the population. And so they're able to go out and do surveys annually to count every member of the population. And, they can tell if orcas have died during the past year or if new calves have been born. And they can keep track of how old individuals are. And so this diagram here is an example of a family tree or matriline from one of the resident populations. It shows the matriarch, who was A34, born in 1975, and she had at least three offspring. I think the ones to the left got cut off in this photo, but her three offspring were A67, born in 97, A80, born in 2004, and A96, born in 2010. And then one of her daughters, A67, then had two offspring of her own, A102 and A112. So they can build these family trees for an entire population, such as the southern residents. So there are about 2,500 orcas in the northeastern Pacific region. They're divided into three known um, ecotypes. These are resident orcas, which feed on fish, primarily salmon, and they tend to stay or live in large, stable groups or pods. And then there are also bigs orcas, also known as transients, which feed on marine mammals, such as seals and sea lions, porpoises, whale calves, and They tend to live in smaller groups, usually under 10 individuals, and um, the group membership is a little bit more fluid. Members in a group may come and go over time. The third ecotype is what's known as an offshore orca. Um, these orcas usually feed on sharks. Um, their group size also very fluid. It can be as small as just a few individuals, or it could be as large as 70 or more. And they tend to be the most wide-ranging of the three ecotypes. They can be, found as far as you know, the Hawaiian Islands, or they could be up near Alaska. And they, as name implies, they tend to occur further offshore than the other ecotypes. So we don't know as much about the offshore orcas as we do about the resident or Biggs orcas. And then just this last year, a paper was published by a group of researchers from the University of British Columbia. Um, and they may have discovered a fourth ecotype off off the west coast. And this was kind of, they had collected these photographs over oh, at least a decade, but they didn't fit in with any of the other three ecotypes. They were kind of in this like miscellaneous category. But then they started to kind of put the pieces together, like, oh well, they're, some individuals kind of look like um, offshore orcas, but others um, look more like a transient orca, and so they're kind of in between. And they were also unique in that they preyed on large sperm whales, which none of the other ecotypes do. And then the other interesting thing about them was that almost all of them had scars from cookie cutter sharks, which are only found in the tropics. And so, they knew that this group spent quite a bit of time in tropical waters, but they've also been seen um, as close as 50 miles off the Oregon coast. So, um, they're thought to be a very wide ranging um, type of orca, and they really don't know much about them. They don't know how many members are in the population, if there's multiple populations or not. So there's, I think, a lot of research that can take place. And unfortunately, it's a big ocean, and so they're not an easy group to study, I don't think. Um, and the ecotypes they're all genetically distinct, and they tend to not interact with each other. In fact, some researchers have seen resident and Biggs orcas deliberately avoid each other when they've been on intersecting paths. So they definitely do not intermingle. That probably explains why they don't interbreed and they're genetically distinct. Um, and then something that was interesting last year was that the resident orcas and Biggs orcas were designated or recognized as separate subspecies, and the uh, the new name for resident orcas is Orcinus orca otter, and for Biggs orcas it's Orcinus orca rectipinus. And the scientists that brought the petition for renaming originally believed that they should be separate species. Um, and, they presented quite a bit of evidence towards that. But when the taxonomic committee of the Society for Marine Mammalogy voted on it, I think that it did not make the cut by like one vote. And the two scientists that had published the paper and brought forth the petition um, they had to recuse themselves from the vote, um, because they were part of they were the petitioners, and if they had not had to recuse themselves, then the vote would have passed, and they would be separate species. So I would, I would have never imagined there would be like drama on the taxonomic committee for the Society of Marine Mammalogy, but there you have it. And I think the reason why um, it didn't pass was because some scientists felt like um, there just wasn't enough information on the other orcas around the world, and they were hesitant to, basically declare a new species when they're in the absence of this other information. So, but in any case, they are recognized as separate subspecies now. And I think I'm going to spend some time focusing on the details between these two ecotypes because they're the ones that are most likely to be seen off the Oregon coast. Um, and so resident orcas, are comprised of four populations. They're the southern residents, of course, and which their main area is from southern British Columbia to as far south as central California. There are the northern residents, which overlap slightly with the southern residents, but extend further north to southeast Alaska. And then there's the South Alaska residents, which um, primarily occur between southeast Alaska and Kodiak Island. And then there are the Western Alaska residents from Kodiak Island to the Bering Sea. And in a similar way, there's three populations of Biggs orcas. The West Coast transients, which range from Southern California to Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska transients, um, which primarily in the Gulf of Alaska, a little bit in the Bering Sea. And then there's the AT1 pod, which is a relatively small population, um, primarily in the Prince William Sound area. And they were heavily impacted by the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. They lost, I think, like a third of their population, maybe more than that. Um, and so the AT1 pod is struggling. The other transient populations are doing pretty well, as are most of the resident populations, except for, of course, the southern residents. Um, and so the populations we see off the Oregon coast are as far as the resident populations go, it would be the southern residents, and then for Biggs, it would be the West Coast population. And so, if you look over on the left side, there's this handy, I guess it's a handout kind of thing that NOAA Fisheries came up with to help people sort of tell the difference between resident and Biggs orcas. Uh, there is a difference in size. Biggs orcas tend to be a little bit larger given at the same age. Um, they also have larger heads and jaws, they found, probably because they're going after larger prey. Their dorsal fins differ. That may be the most easily recognizable difference. The dorsal fins in Biggs orcas tend to have a pointier tip. In males, the dorsal fin tends to be uh, just very vertical with a pointed tip, and then the females are more curved, but again with a very pointed tip. Um, with the resident orcas, the large male resident orcas their dorsal fins will often, like the top part of it, will be slightly cocked forward. And then for resident females, again, the dorsal fin's curved, but, or yes, curved, and then the tip is much more rounded than in a female Biggs orca. And so that's something you can see in photos, or if you're lucky to see one in person, you might be able to tell the difference just by looking at their dorsal fins. And then their saddle patches are also a little bit different, especially in the females. The residents tend to have what's called an open saddle patch, where there's an area of black pigmentation inside of the saddle patch, and then Biggs orcas tend to have what's called a closed saddle patch, where it's just kind of a uniform pigmentation throughout the saddle patch. Um, let's see, we talked about groups structure, group size being different, and prey being different. Something that's interesting to me is, their hunting styles are very different as well. Resident orcas, because they feed on salmon, relatively, small prey, um, more dispersed, I think. So that's why they tend to rely on hunting in larger groups, and they use a lot of echolocation, because that helps them to detect that smaller prey. Um, Whereas the Biggs orcas, um, because they're going after, marine mammals like seals or sea lions, which tend to be pretty wary of their surroundings. Uh, that's why Biggs orcas tend to hunt in much smaller groups and uh, do not make, they do not echolocate or communicate while they're hunting. And I've got kind of an interesting story from, I guess, my personal experience, that uh, of just how wary like seals and sea lions can be. Like several years ago, I was visiting the San Juan Islands, which is kind of the epicenter for orca viewing in the Northwest. And the place we were staying at was on this little bay, and every day there was this little seal, harbor seal, that would, kind of pop up in the middle of the bay. And sometimes it was chasing bait fish, other times it was just kind of playing around. And one day I noticed that the seal wasn't there. And I thought, oh, that's kind of strange. And then I saw it over in this little alcove. The seal was in there with like two or three other seals, and they were just all huddled into this tiny little alcove, kind of just like, you know, crammed in there next to the rocks. And I thought, oh, that's really weird. And just a short time later, a group of transient orcas passed by, and they were probably within like 50 or 60 yards of the seals, but you could tell they were in travel mode. They were moving pretty fast and doing a lot of porpoising, and they were probably, making a lot of noise, communicating and things like that. And so I think the seals probably detected their presence and then decided they were going to hide in this little alcove, to avoid the orcas. I think if the orcas had been hunting, I think they definitely would have shut off the communication, and it probably would have made it more difficult for the seals to detect them. So anyway, that's my theory for why Biggs orcas appear to be silent when they're foraging. Um, in terms of range, there's some differences. Resident orcas. Um, I think the thought in the past was that they tended to kind of stay in the same area, and especially for like the southern residents, it was thought to be the Salish Sea, especially around the San Juan Islands. There's a little bit more to it than that. They do move around a little bit more than previously thought, but this still kind of follows a seasonal pattern. So, like with the southern residents, they do spend most of the summer uh, in the Salish Sea, in the vicinity of the San Juan Islands. But in the fall, well, in the summer, the reason they're there is because Chinook salmon are returning to the Fraser River in southern BC, and so that's where they tend to congregate. But in the fall, when Chinook numbers are starting to go down, but chum salmon are starting to arrive in Puget Sound, then the southern residents will usually move further down into Puget Sound. Sometimes as far as near the Seattle area. So there are these kind of seasonal movements from area to area that's been really kind of passed on from generation to generation within these resident populations. Transient orcas, it's a different story. They tend to be, as their name implies, they tend to be on the move. They don't stay in one area for very long. They have much larger range. Um, and so they tend to move up and down the coast a lot more. Um, and then as far as acoustics go, resident orcas, uh, they tend to have like pod specific dialects, whereas I think um, it's not quite so specific with Biggs orcas. There's not as much differentiation of acoustic patterns. So now we move on to the focusing on the southern resident orcas. They're comprised of three pods called J, K, and L. They do live in, very tight family units. So vocalizations are maybe even more important for them because it helps them to not only communicate, but it also strengthens their social bonds. And because they are fish eaters, echolocation obviously is very important for them. Their preferred prey is Chinook salmon, probably because of their large size and high fat content. So, for the amount of foraging effort that they put in, it's kind of the biggest bang for the buck. But there have been some recent reproductive issues with the southern residents. Usually, uh, orcas try to mate with other orcas from different pods, but maybe because the southern resident population is so small, there tends to be more uh, mating within the same pod, and so this has led to some inbreeding issues with the population. Also, there's been a fair number of late-term miscarriages, and um, a lot of southern resident females of reproductive age have not been able to successfully have calves. So, um, these reproductive issues have definitely made recovery of the population more difficult. So moving on to their habitat, they have been found as far north as Southeast Alaska, but that was, I think, only um, one occurrence. Um, but the range does, extend from Southeast Alaska down to Central California in the Monterey Bay area. In 2006, NOAA Fisheries designated critical habitat for the southern residents after they were listed as endangered under the federal ESA. The original critical habitat for them only included Washington's inland waters, which is that sort of medium blue area on the map. And then in 2021, NOAA expanded their critical habitat to include the outer coastal waters from the Canadian border near Cape Flattery, Washington, all the way down to Point Sur, California, just south of Monterey. And um, it was the critical habitat was between the 6 and 200 meter depth contours. So that's why, it, that area looks the way it is. This critical habitat expansion was based on recent data from satellite tagging study, um, and also other studies that used acoustic recordings and visual observations. The data showed that the coastal waters are used in winter and spring by two of the pods, K and L, and that the Oregon coast was an important travel corridor for them as they moved between foraging areas to the north and south. In addition, they found that the Columbia River mouth was really a foraging hotspot for those two pods. And um, I've got this little diagram that I borrowed from NOAA that showed the uh, track from one of the satellite tagged southern residents. And this track um, took place over about a 3 week period in March. And so this orca kind of went up and down the Washington and Oregon coast, but it kept circling back to the mouth of the Columbia. Um, Probably because March is when spring Chinook salmon start to return to that river. So um, it spent quite a bit of time near the mouth of the Columbia. And so we know that's an important feeding area for them. And another interesting thing about the southern residents is that they've never been documented as entering um, an enclosed bay or river mouth. They have entered Monterey Bay, but that is, I guess, is considered an open bay. But they've never entered an enclosed bay like the Quina Bay or Tillamook Bay or any of those bays, or even the Columbia River. Um, so when we do hear of orcas sighted um, in the Umpqua River or in Yaquina Bay or Coos Bay. Those have all been big orcas. I guess we shouldn't say that resident orcas never or have never entered a river mouth or a bay. It's possible they have, and they just never have been observed, but definitely never been verified. So this graph shows the population size for southern residents between 1960 and 2024, and you can see it's fluctuated quite a bit over those 60 years, averaging about 83 orcas. There were two major periods of decline, or two periods of major decline during that time. The first one was in the late 60s and early 70s, when orcas were removed from the southern resident population for aquariums and marine parks. And the southern residents lost about 30% of their population during that time. It was pretty devastating. And, I think it's had long lasting impacts since then, even after the collections ended in the early 70s. Um, the southern residents did gradually rebuild to a peak of about 98 orcas in 1995. But since then, there's been a second period of decline that's been more gradual, but definitely longer lasting. And at first, the decline coincided with um, poor salmon abundance in the late 90s. Um, but since then, the southern resident population has continued to decline, even during periods when, Chinook abundance was a little better. So obviously, there's other things going on other than just the amount of prey, and I'll get into that shortly. Um, and so there current population as of July 1st of last year, at the end of that census, was 73 orcas, with 25 in J pod, 15 in K, and 33 in L. Um, and then over the last few years, the um, population numbers have kind of stabilized. Um, but I think it's due to um, the recent births and mortalities sort of canceling each other out. So, like, I've noticed in the last few years, one year there might be two calves born, um, and no no adult mortalities that year, and you think that's great, but then the calves die, um, and then the following year, um, again there might be two calves born, and those calves survive, but then there'll be two adult mortalities. So it's been kind of going like back and forth like that for the last few years, and so that's why it looks like the population is stabilized. And I suppose that's better than a continuous steep decline, but it means that the population is struggling to increase. Um, and NOAA, they did some modeling work about 5 years ago during the last status review, which indicated that if the poor reproduction in the population continued, that uh, the population would continue to decline over the next potentially 25 years.
Hey, Howard. Real quick, there's
Yes.
a little box on the bottom.
Oh,
That's, yeah, thank you.
sorry. I thought that was something I just saw. And, um, yeah, thanks for letting me know that, Annie. Um, so there's three main threats um, to the population's survival and chances for recovery, and they're pretty well known. They've been known for many years now, and the three are lack of prey, lack of salmon, specifically Chinook salmon, um, environmental contaminants, and vessel and noise disturbance. Um, each of these threats can sort of act independently on the southern resident population. For example, lack of prey. Obviously, there's far fewer Chinook salmon around now than there were 150 years ago. So that's had an impact, obviously, on southern residents. Um, and so this lack of prey can lead to malnutrition and mortality, poor reproduction. So that can be a direct effect on the population. Environmental contaminants. Typically, orcas are exposed to contaminants through their consumption of contaminated prey, and so they feed on salmon that have um, you know been exposed to contaminants through by feeding on maybe bait fish that um, have contaminants, which are have been feeding on plankton that um, might be in polluted waters. So um, those contaminants are amplified as they work their way up the food chain to orcas. And the thing that makes it especially difficult is that a lot of these pollutants are what are called persistent organic pollutants, and as name implies, they're they're very slow to degrade in the environment. They tend to uh, last for a long time. Some of these, you know, are PCBs and DDT, which have been banned in the U.S. for a long time, but um, they continue to linger in the environment. And the other thing about them is that they're fat soluble, so they're not metabolized quickly out of the orca's bodies. They tend to be stored in their blubber, and when it is metabolized, then it's released into their bloodstream, where it can cause problems with their immune system or reproduction. And so, that's a direct effect that contaminants can have on orcas. And then in terms of vessel and noise disturbance, um, they found that vessels, especially traveling at high speeds, um, produce a lot of noise with their propellers, and that background noise interferes with the orca's ability to communicate with each other, and then also makes it more difficult for them to echolocate and um, find prey. And um, so this is, a direct effect that vessels, can have on the orcas. But what makes it even trickier is that these threats can interact with each other and sort of have cumulative effects. For example, uh, you know, this noise disturbance or vessel disturbance can make it more difficult for orcas to find their prey, even in times when their prey is relatively abundant. And that may explain why, even in some years when Chinook abundance is pretty good, um, they still have a hard time finding enough food. It could be because there's too much background noise disturbance, and of course, when prey abundance is low, uh, you know, the effects are compounded because now it's more difficult for them to find already more difficult to find prey. So um, that's how something like noise disturbance can affect their ability to get enough food, which then, if they're not getting enough um, prey, then their bodies need to utilize the energy in their blubber, which means the contaminants get released into their bloodstream, which then, you know, can have harmful effects on the orcas. So I think even though we, you know, we know of these threats and we've known for a very long time, I think because of these interactions and complexities, that's what one of the things that makes recovery so difficult for southern residents. Um, so just quickly, the southern residents have been listed in many jurisdictions. Canada was actually the first government to list them as endangered back in 2001. The state of Washington uh, listed southern residents and other orcas as endangered under their state ESA in 2004. As I mentioned, the federal government listed them in the US in 2005. And then last year, the Oregon's Fish and Wildlife Commission voted to list them as endangered in this state. And so often, people will ask, well, what's the difference between the federal and state listings? And although there's some similarities, both prohibit the take of the species. So um, it's against the law to kill or collect animals of the species. But I think the major difference is that the federal listing primarily affects federal agencies, um, because under the federal listing or the ESA listing, um, any federal agency that um, is engaging in an activity that could harm southern residents or their critical habitat needs to confer with NOAA Fisheries um, uh, prior to undertaking that activity, or if it's not a federal agency, if there's a federal nexus, like you receive federal funding, or you have to, if there a federal permit's required, or if there's some kind of federal nexus, then state agencies or local governments may also need to consult with NOAA. And so a state agency that doesn't have a federal access might not necessarily be affected by the federal listing, but a state listing does affect state agencies. And so in Oregon, our Endangered Species Act, once a species is listed as endangered, then by law, certain things need to happen. Agencies need to be identified that have a role to play in the conservation of that species. Some agencies need to develop management plans. Other ones need to document what roles and actions they're going to take. So it basically, the state listing engages the state agencies. So they're, in a way, I guess you could view them as sort of complementary to each other. So I just wanted to show this short video. It's features Lynn Berry. Some of you may be familiar with Lynn. She recently retired from NOAA Fisheries. I kind of think of her as the OG of southern resident recovery, because she worked on the original federal listing and played a big role in writing the federal recovery plan for the southern residents. And so I thought it'd be best to let her describe some of the research that's been done recently with the southern residents and some of the actions that are being taken to help recover the population.
Southern residents are amazing animals. They live in stable family groups. They use sound to communicate with each other and to find their food. Southern residents are fish eaters. They like Chinook salmon in particular, and they're just really unique parts of our culture here in the Pacific Northwest. Southern resident killer whales are endangered, and their population level is the lowest we've seen in several decades. There's three main threats. We're not sure the whales are getting enough of their Chinook salmon prey to eat. The whales also use sound to find their food, and so vessels and sound in the environment can interfere with their ability to find prey. The whales have high levels of contaminants. Because they're such a small population, they're at risk for something like an oil spill or a disease outbreak that could affect the entire population. There's an active research program so we can learn more about how these threats are affecting the whales and inform conservation and management actions to address those threats. We're using passive acoustic monitors in the environment to understand how the whales are using that habitat. We can also use digital acoustic tags, and those tags help us understand the whale's behavior, how they're diving, how they're responding to sound and vessels in their environment, and how that might impact their foraging activity. We're using drones to take aerial photos of the whales. We can look at their body condition and see if they're getting enough to eat. We can also tell if females are pregnant. We can collect scales and tissue from the prey that they're eating. And we can also get breath samples and understand pathogens that might be causing disease for the whales. And then there's killer whale poop. By collecting samples following behind the whales, we're able to learn about what they're eating. We can get genetics of the salmon as well as the individual whales. We can also learn about hormones and contaminants. Killer whale poop has a wealth of information. Southern residents have been identified as a species in the spotlight because of their population decline as well as their high risk for extinction. Some of the new initiatives that have come out of this program are partnerships at the Canadian level with the state of Washington and at the local level Priority actions include increasing critical prey for the whales, understanding what's causing problems with their health and their reproduction. I'm hopeful that there is a chance for recovery of southern resident killer whales. They're such an essential element of our ecosystem. And if we can all work together to support recovery, they can once again thrive as part of the food web and the ecosystem that we all share into the future.
Okay, so building a little bit on what Lynn talked about, you know, even though the southern residents are arguably like one of the most heavily studied or intensively studied cetaceans in the world, there's still quite a bit that we don't know about them. And, you know, there is some information, I think, especially from like a management agency's perspective, there's some things that would definitely help with guiding recovery efforts. So one of those things is, or pieces of information is, it would be nice to have some updated data on you know, southern resident presence or movements off the Oregon coast. The satellite tagging data was great. It provided very detailed data on you know, the depths that they traveled at, how far from shore they traveled, you know, where they tended to linger, and so on and so forth. But it is going on, you know, 10, 15 years since that data was collected. So it would be good to have more recent data on their presence off the Oregon coast. I think especially since there have been indications lately that the two pods that use the coastal waters K and L are returning to the Salish Sea later and later than they used to. Um, you know, they used to show up at, you know, during June, right about now, probably, when, you know, at the end of spring and beginning of the summer, when Chinook start returning to the Fraser River. It's thought that because the Fraser River runs are much lower than they used to be, that that may be why they're not returning when they used to. They may be spending more time elsewhere where prey might be relatively more abundant. So it'd be good to have more information on, you know, are they spending more time along the Oregon coast now? Are they staying in our waters until June or even July? You know, that kind of information would be helpful. Um, Also, I think it'd be good to get better information on the dietary needs of the southern residents. In the past, they've done some modeling as far as trying to estimate, you know, how many Chinook salmon the southern resident population needs in a year. But a lot of that modeling was based on, you know, metabolic rates of captive um, orcas, um, you know, which obviously differ from wild orcas, and you know, I mean, granted, it is very difficult to get that information from wild orcas, but I think, uh, you know, ideally, if they can figure out a way to somehow do it, I think that would, to be able to know, you know, approximately how many salmon they need to maintain a healthy population would definitely be helpful, um, as far as ensuring enough prey for that population. Um, Another thing or a piece of information that's helpful is, you know, determining the contaminant thresholds for orcas. You know, we know that pollutants have negative effects on them, but you know, I think because, you know, it would be impossible to eliminate all contaminants. I think knowing where the threshold is would be helpful as far as um, being able to take realistic actions to reduce contaminants in the environment. So that information, I think, would be good to know. And then just from a scientific standpoint, I think it would be great to find out more information on this potential fourth ecotype that occurs off the Oregon coast. And granted, it would be there would be a difficult population to study just because they're so far ranging and they're out in the open ocean. One researcher described it as like literally trying to find a needle in the haystack kind of thing. So, but I think just from a science perspective, trying to learn more about orcas in general, I think that would be kind of neat to do more research in that area. And so now getting to recovery actions, specifically, what can the state of Oregon do to help with orca recovery? As Annie mentioned earlier, one of the things we're working on right now is, 3 of our agencies are working on endangered species management plans that'll outline, actions that we can take to help with recovery. And although that's an important part of, you know, Oregon's efforts, um, you know, I think there's several agencies that can be involved in helping to recover the southern resident population, and I think just the the endangered listing in Oregon has really sort of engaged all of these agencies altogether. There's, I think, around 7 or 8 different agencies involved now, and so that's something that's definitely that the listing has definitely helped to engage these state agencies, and um, we've all, I think, learned a lot about the southern residents, a lot more than we knew uh, a year or two ago. And I think now, when we undertake management actions, I think we're taking we're keeping the southern residents in mind and how our actions might affect that population. And so I think that's kind of the direction we're headed in right now in Oregon, and we're just getting started uh, with the process, and so that those are some of the things that the state's doing. But there's obviously a lot of things that we can all do as individuals as well to help with the southern residents. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here as far as I've got this list of things that people can do to help, and a lot of these things are things that help the environment in general, other species other than orcas, human beings. I mean, I guess it just goes to show how interconnected everything and everyone are. But I think if we all do what we can in our daily lives, we try to reduce the amount of contaminants and pollutants that get into storm drains and uh, have to go through treatment plants, that a lot of these chemicals are difficult to treat. So you know, the less contaminants we're putting into that are ultimately making their way to waterways, where they affect salmon, many species, and then ultimately orcas. I, you know, we could all be doing our part. And some things, specifically for salmon, like conserving water for salmon streams. Obviously, the less water we consume, the more water can stay in streams for juvenile salmon to rear in before they head out to the ocean, for adults to be able to spawn in when they return. Um, and specifically, I would urge voters, or not voters, but boaters, to follow the established viewing guidelines for whales and orcas, which is the federal guideline is 100 to stay at least 100 yards from any whales or orcas, and then um, you know volunteer, help plant trees in riparian areas next to salmon streams, help with beach cleanups, and maybe most importantly right now, especially as we're just kind of beginning our efforts to help orcas, is spreading the word, increasing awareness of this population. You know, Earlier this spring, I worked out at the Whale Watching Center in Depot Bay with my counterparts with the Parks and Recreation Department, and talked to a lot of visitors there during spring break, Whale Watch Week. And um, there were a lot of people that were not aware that there was an endangered population of orcas that spend time off the Oregon coast. Most people were familiar with the marine mammal eating orcas, but they did not know that southern residents spent time down here. They just figured they were, you know, spend their time up in the Puget Sound area, and I think that's um, a very common misconception, um, and you can't really blame people because until recently the research didn't show um, that they did spend much time down there, down off the Oregon coast. I mean, we kind of knew that they passed through this area because they've been observed as far as California, or as far south as California. But until they did those satellite tagging studies and acoustic studies, they didn't really know, how often they came down here or how much time they spent in this area. So it's easy to see how people could think that they're just um, orcas that live in Puget Sound. And so I think it's important to, show the connection between this endangered population and the state of Oregon. I think that'll help us to engage more people in the state to help with their recovery. And if you're interested in more information on the Southern residents, we have lots of links on our website. To NOAA's website. Washington has a lot of good information. And with that, I thank you again for listening to my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Howard. So I am happy to field questions for you. There's a handful that came in the webinar chat, so I'll start with those and then go to the Q&A. So let's see. The first one is from Anne. It says, I'd been told that Southern residents will sometimes starve to death when salmon is not available. If that's true, what are your thoughts on why they would not just broaden their consumption of other fish? Because orcas are smart.
Well, that's a good question. The thing about Southern residents is they're pretty particular on the kind of food that they eat. They've evolved over a long period of time to eat Chinook salmon, for good reason, because if you're going to expend as much energy as they do hunting down prey and pursuing them and capturing them, you want to get the biggest bang for your buck. And in the salmon world, those are Chinook salmon. And they're not necessarily the most abundant salmon. There's smaller species like sockeye and pink salmon that are far more abundant than Chinook. which is why, I think it's crazy sometimes, when some of these studies have found that, even during periods when there's way more sockeye salmon passing through the Salish Sea, they will still focus on Chinook. And so I think, these are very special. This is, these are very specialized animals, and they just cannot. They're not like humans that can just, you know, you you have to eat less meat. So okay, well I'll eat more vegetables, kind of thing. They can't just do that. They can't just change. This is something that just evolved over a long period of time.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Next question is, are there opportunities or projects for volunteers to help restore habitat to boost Chinook populations in Oregon and therefore increase prey source for orcas?
Yeah, just speaking for ODFW, we have a pretty large volunteer program. And so our biologists are always looking for folks to help with projects, which, they might include helping to plant trees in riparian areas, to provide shade for salmon streams, and stabilize the banks. Um, you know, um, and if you go to our website, there's links to our volunteer program there, and so that plenty of opportunities, definitely.
That's great. I would also add, depending on where you live on the coast, there's a lot of watershed councils
Mm,
and local groups that do active restoration for watersheds and for salmon habitat in particular. So I would
right.
check those out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Lots of watershed councils.
Let's see. The next question is, why are southern resident orca pods J, K, and L? Are there other pods named A through I?
Oh, I wish I knew. I have no idea why they're JK now. I know there's other pods like the northern residents. They have a lot more pods. They may have used up many of the other letters.
Okay, I'm gonna try and put two together. All right, so what is the population of Biggs transients to your knowledge? How is that population doing? And then another question I'm just gonna add is somebody heard that there's a resurgence in the collection of orcas for aquariums and sea parks. Is this true? Are we moving backwards in that way?
Hmm. Okay. Well, I guess as far as the first question, the West Coast Bigs population, which is what we see off of Oregon, I think they number somewhere in the area of 300 or 400 orcas, which is considered relatively healthy. And I think the population is actually growing because sort of the resurgence in numbers of marine mammals since the 70s. And so um, the basically all of the transient or bigs population, with the exception of that one up in the Prince William Sound, still struggling after the Exxon Valdez incident. So, but the other transient populations seem to be doing pretty well. And sorry, I forgot the second question.
Yeah, I guess so. This person is curious if there is a resurgence in the collection of orcas for sea
Hmm.
parks, and then they also mentioned that they're referring to other countries. Have you heard anything about that?
I have not heard anything about that. I know, um, definitely not for the southern residents because of their listing status. Um, but I have not heard anything about other countries.
That's fair. Hopefully not. I'll just throw that out there. All right, so the next question is, where and when are we most likely to see them on the Oregon coast? Southern residents, I guess.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I was talking about, you know, working out at the whale watching center over spring break, and I had just told everybody that, oh, it's rare that we see southern residents off the Oregon coast 'cause most of the time they're transients. So, and because, with 73 individuals and then only two of the pods, so about two-thirds of those actually travel up and down the Oregon coast. Um, and, so the chances are not great. And so that's what I was telling people was like, oh, if you're lucky, you know, you, you might see some southern residents out there. And like, I think it was like a day or two later, a group of whale watching boats actually saw a group of southern residents, like L Pod, I think, came through. And so, you know, I don't know. You can get really lucky sometimes, but generally, they're down here during the winter and spring. So usually, the best if you are going to see them, it's probably going to be like March, April during that time frame.
I will say there's been a lot of transient sightings recently,
Mm,
particularly in Yaquina Bay and Winchester Bay,
mm.
more than I've heard of in previous years. So that's been really fun. Um, okay, so the next question is: are you concerned about the definition of harm being changed under the Endangered Species Act, and how will that affect southern resident recovery? Good question.
That is a good question. You know, I mean, I guess you assume with the federal listing there is certain protections, right? And one of those being, no harm to the species or its critical habitat. And so I think inherently when you change the definition of harm, it affects those protections.
I agree. And if you guys hang tight, we have some actions related to that one in particular. Um, all right, I think we only have time for the one last question. Is the Klamath River producing more Chinook salmon since the dam has been removed?
Well, there's only been one adult return since removal, and that was this past fall. And so it's way too early to tell if, it's helping to increase the population. But uh, what they did find was, I think those salmon that did return this past fall, you know, um, basically moved up into areas that they didn't expect them to be moving into just yet. I think nobody told the salmon that they weren't supposed to go into those streams just yet. And so I think that's probably the most amazing part of that story is that they're already recolonizing these streams that they haven't been in for 100 years. That's amazing.
Yeah, I feel like that is a conservation story that I'm just going to consider a win and be
Hmm.
excited about. I hope to see more salmon returns in upcoming years. We need
Right.
more conservation wins these days.
Yes.
Um, okay, well, we are we're running out of time, and I do want to get to a handful of follow-ups. So, um, thank you so much again for the presentation, Howard. Um, and let's see, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, are we good? Can folks see it? Okay, well, just to wrap things up, I didn't want to leave you all with, sad news about um, the poor populations of southern resident and the situation that they're in with many stressors. I want to leave on somewhat of a positive note. So we do have a handful of action items that folks can take, and um, along with many of the action items that Howard listed about changing everyday behavior to help improve conditions in which Southern residents live. But this one is specifically related to the Endangered Species Act and changing the definition of harm. And I do just want to note that the rest of these action items are, the opinion of Oregon Shores and not of ODFW. So we're asking folks for Orca Action Month to take action and sign this petition to Congress to protect the Endangered Species Act. This changing this definition of harm could have widespread impacts on all kinds of imperiled species across the nation. And really, this Endangered Species Act has been incredibly successful at recovering many species. So you can scan that QR code, and it takes 2 seconds to just sign a petition asking Congress to defend this really bedrock environmental law. So I would really appreciate if folks took action there. And I will also follow up with some links to everything at the end and as a follow-up email. The next one is hot off the press. And this is for Oregon specifically. And really, I just wanted to make sure that folks had some actions that they could take in Oregon, because while things feel really helpless at the federal level in terms of environmental protections being slashed, we really have a lot of power to act locally here in Oregon. And there's some great things happening in the Oregon legislature right now. So there's a bill right now that's being deliberated. It's called 1% for Wildlife, or House Bill 2977. And it just passed out of the House Revenue Committee, and it's heading to the House floor for a vote this week, followed by a Senate vote next week. And this bill is really awesome. It would be a game changer for conservation initiatives in Oregon, because it actually provides a new and long-term revenue stream for state agencies to implement conservation and marine programs, which are currently largely funded by fish and game permits and grants and things like that. So they're subject to fluctuations in state budgets, and they're not very sustainable in the long term. And so, yeah, this bill would, for a small 1% increase in transient lodging taxes, would allow this whole new revenue stream that would then allow Oregon's State Wildlife Action Plan to be better funded, as well as many nearshore marine programs. And there will also be money for wildlife rehabilitation. So in many ways, this bill could help Southern residents by providing more capacity to agencies like ODFW to do this work. And so you can help move this bill forward by contacting your legislators and asking them to vote yes this week on the House and the Senate floor. And I will drop a link in the chat to help you find your legislator. And you could just say, really quick email, support House Bill 2977. So I will follow up with more information about that as well. For the remainder of Orca Action Month, we have a handful of other events. So for folks that are in Washington, there's Orca Fest in Seattle. Here in Oregon, and I guess wherever you are, there's going to be another webinar, more focused on the salmon and what we need to do to save salmon. And so that is going to be on June 24th. And that's sponsored by Environment Oregon. And then on June 28th, I think it's the American Cetacean Society are hosting the Orca Action Day at Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport. So that's a great way to just close out a month of all kinds of activities for orcas. And you can visit orcamonth.org to see this full calendar. There's all kinds of stuff. And if you're in Washington, there's even more stuff for you to do. And then I'll put the registration for the follow-up webinar in the chat in just a moment. We've also got some exciting new opportunities to help Oregon's orcas. So as you heard tonight, there are some data gaps in our understanding of where Southern residents are and what areas they're utilizing. So Oregon Shores is working with adventure scientists to launch a brand new community science killer whale monitoring program off the Oregon coast. And so that's going to be kicking off in the fall of this year. We're in the process of developing it. So you can be one of the first volunteers to sign up if you live in Oregon, and we'll give you more information and be sure to contact you as soon as the program is live. So you can scan the QR code to volunteer, and then again, I'll send you the link in just a moment. And yeah, just to close up, there are so many ways that you can support Oregon Shores and the work we do and get involved with us. So you can volunteer, you can donate, and really every dollar makes a difference to help us continue to do this work. It really means a lot when folks give their time or their money to support us. You could also buy merch. We actually just refreshed our whole merchandise catalog with our new logo, and then we also have specialty Orca merch for Orca Action Month. So definitely check that out in our shop. And then if you want to follow along and track what we're doing, you can sign up for our newsletter. And really, this is the best way to hear about all kinds of events that are happening on the coast, volunteer opportunities. We also have action items that people can take to speak up on various public policy initiatives. So the best way to follow us would be to sign up for our newsletter, but then you can also find us on social media, visit our website to learn more, etc. So let me put all of those links in the chat. And I'll let you all get on your merry way. I'm sorry we kept you a little bit later than expected. Oh, Rochelle, thank you for plugging in a handful of the links. Yeah, so I will send everyone a follow-up email and that lays out all of these items. Another request that I did see in the chat for you, Howard, is to send the link of the NOAA video that you shared. That would be super helpful to share out.
Sure, I can do that. I'll send it to you, and then you can.
Okay.
Or is there another avenue I can post it?
Yeah.
Or
I think sending it to me would work, and then I can put it in my list of resources that I'll be sending out to
okay,
all participants.
all right, sounds good.
Great. Thank you. Well, I really appreciate you for taking the time, Howard, to chat with us today. I learned that we won't see Southern residents in our estuaries, so that was news to me. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time and all the work you're doing to develop the Endangered Species Management Plan. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to attend today. Happy Orca Action Month to all, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. Bye, everyone.